A surveillance camera at a Sarasota car wash captures an image that would soon shock the nation. A young girl, just 11 years old, is seen walking alone. A man approaches, grabs her arm, and leads her away. Within minutes, she disappears from view. It is the last time she will ever be seen alive. Carlie Jane Brucia was born on March 16, 1992, in Sarasota, Florida. She grew up in a suburban neighborhood surrounded by family, friends, and the routines of school and community life. By the beginning of 2004, Carlie was 11 years old, entering the threshold between childhood and adolescence. Those who knew her described a girl with ordinary interests for her age, moving through the early years of middle school and enjoying time with peers close to home. On February 1, 2004, Carlie was returning from a friend's house in Sarasota. It was an otherwise normal Sunday when she began walking along familiar streets toward her home. Her parents quickly noticed her absence and, within about 30 minutes of her expected return, reported her missing. What might have been first seen as a short delay soon escalated into a case that would draw national attention. Behind a local car wash, a security camera recorded what happened next. The footage captured a man in his 30s approach Carlie, seize her by the arm, and lead her away from view. Another camera caught a vehicle nearby, later tied to the crime. The grainy video was later enhanced by NASA specialists, providing investigators with a stabilized sequence that became central evidence. Within hours, law enforcement distributed the images nationally, triggering a flood of tips, mobilizing federal agencies, and transforming Carlie's disappearance into a race against time. As the surveillance video of Carlie Brucia's abduction aired across local and national outlets, tips began to arrive almost immediately. Among them were calls from at least 2 informants who stated that the man shown resembled Joseph P. Smith, a 37-year-old Sarasota auto mechanic and father of 3. Smith had a long history of drug-related arrests and a prior case involving kidnapping and false imprisonment, details that quickly elevated him in the eyes of investigators. While the public was just beginning to connect the broadcast image with Smith's name, police had already taken him into custody on an unrelated matter. On February 3, 2004, only 2 days after Carlie vanished, Smith was arrested for violating his parole conditions. He remained detained as officers pursued confirmation that the man in the video and the man in custody were one and the same. By February 6th, authorities formally announced Joseph Smith as the prime suspect and confirmed that his vehicle had been directly linked to the crime. The national distribution of the enhanced video, stabilized with NASA's imaging technology, strengthened the evidentiary weight of the recordings. At this point, investigators had a named suspect under lock, a vehicle connected to the abduction, and eyewitness recognition triggered by the televised footage. The immediate priority shifted. With Smith detained, the search effort turned away from suspect pursuit and toward the most urgent questions still unanswered: finding Carlie and determining what had happened after the images captured her final moments in public view. On February 5, 2004, 4 days after Carlie Brucia's abduction, investigators obtained the most decisive lead from the suspect himself. While in custody, Joseph P. Smith disclosed where he had hidden her body. Acting on that information, police searched behind the Central Church of Christ on Proctor Road in Sarasota, where they discovered Carlie's remains in a wooded area. The site was only a few miles from her home and within the same community where the abduction had taken place. The recovery ended the frantic search that had followed the release of the surveillance video and confirmed the worst fears of investigators, family, and the public. A post-mortem examination established 2 grim findings. First, Carlie had been sexually assaulted while still alive. Second, she had died from strangulation, consistent with ligature or manual force. These findings demonstrated a continuous sequence of violent acts: abduction, sexual battery, and homicide within a matter of days. The discovery site itself held evidentiary value. The wooded grounds behind the church were close enough to populated neighborhoods to risk exposure, yet concealed enough to allow the body to remain hidden for several days. For investigators, this proximity underscored both the rapid timeline and the local character of the crime. With the recovery and forensic determinations, the investigation shifted decisively. The missing child case became a homicide, and prosecutors prepared charges that combined the abduction, sexual battery, and murder into a single criminal episode anchored by both the video evidence and the recovered body. On February 20th, 2004, less than 3 weeks after the abduction, a Sarasota County grand jury returned an indictment against Joseph P. Smith. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery. These charges reflected the complete sequence of events reconstructed by investigators: the forcible abduction documented on surveillance footage, the confirmed sexual assault of an 11-year-old child, and the homicide by strangulation established during autopsy. Smith's custodial timeline supported the speed with which prosecutors acted. He had already been arrested on February 3rd for violating parole, and was in custody before being publicly named as the prime suspect on February 6th. By the time of indictment, investigators had connected his movements and vehicle to the abduction and recovery site, while his custodial statement directed authorities to Carlie's body. The combination of the surveillance images, public tips, forensic determinations, and Smith's own disclosure provided the foundation for the grand jury's decision. The indictment formally transitioned the case from investigation to prosecution. Discovery materials were prepared, including the enhanced surveillance video stabilized by NASA researchers, forensic analyses from the medical examiner, and chain of custody documentation. Prosecutors structured the charges to reflect maximum severity under Florida law, with the murder count carrying potential death eligibility. With indictment returned, the case moved toward trial preparation. The legal process now shifted to courtroom proceedings, where both the state and defense would confront the evidentiary record. The trial of Joseph P. Smith commenced on November 7, 2005, in Sarasota, Florida. Prosecutors presented a case centered on the surveillance footage, enhanced by NASA specialists to stabilize the images, which clearly showed Smith approaching and leading away 11-year-old Carlie Brucia from the car wash on February 1, 2004. Multiple witnesses identified Smith as the man in the video, and his custodial disclosure of the body's location provided further confirmation of his involvement. Expert medical testimony detailed the cause of death as strangulation and confirmed that Carlie had been subjected to sex prior to her passing. Forensic findings reinforced these conclusions, presenting the jury with evidence of both the assault and the fatal act. The prosecution argued that the sequence of events formed one continuous criminal episode: the abduction recorded on camera, the sexual assault, and the subsequent concealment of the victim's body behind the Central Church of Christ. The defense sought to question aspects of the identification process and the forensic handling of evidence. However, the jury concluded that the prosecution had established its case beyond a reasonable doubt. On November 17, 2005, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict of guilt on all charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery. This outcome marked the end of the trial phase, firmly establishing Smith's legal responsibility and moving the proceedings into the sentencing stage, where the ultimate penalty would be considered under Florida law. Following the guilty verdict in November 2005, the case entered the sentencing phase. On December 1, 2005, the jury voted 10-2 to recommend that Joseph P. Smith receive the death penalty for the charge of first-degree murder. Under Florida law at the time, a non-unanimous recommendation was sufficient to support the imposition of a death sentence. On March 15, 2006, the presiding judge formally sentenced Smith to death by lethal injection for the murder of Carlie Brucia. In addition, he received 2 separate life sentences for the crimes of capital sexual battery and kidnapping. These sentences reflected the gravity of the offenses: an abduction in broad daylight, an assault against a vulnerable child, and a homicide confirmed through medical examination. The combination of punishments, death for the homicide and life imprisonment for the accompanying charges, was intended to ensure accountability for every stage of the criminal act. At this point, the judicial record established Smith's final convictions and sentences. However, as is customary in capital cases, the matter did not end with sentencing. Automatic appellate review would follow, opening the case to scrutiny by higher courts in Florida and, eventually, federal review. Although subsequent legal challenges would later affect the status of Smith's death sentence, the 2006 judgment fixed the baseline outcome: convictions on all counts, 2 life terms, and a sentence of death for the murder of Carlie Brucia. Following the 2006 sentencing, Joseph P. Smith's case entered the appellate phase. Automatic review is required in Florida capital cases, and over the years, the matter was considered at multiple judicial levels. In June 2011, the United States Supreme Court rejected an appeal filed on Smith's behalf. Later that year, in October 2011, the court directed the state of Florida to respond to a federal claim alleging that Smith's constitutional right to confront witnesses had been violated. The claim centered on DNA evidence presented at trial without the direct testimony of the laboratory technician who had conducted the testing. Ultimately, this confrontation argument was dismissed after the Supreme Court decided a related case, Williams v. Illinois, leaving Smith's conviction and sentence intact. Significant developments came later with the 2016 Supreme Court ruling in Hurst v. Florida. That decision required that all jury recommendations for the death penalty in Florida be unanimous, a marked change from the earlier system that allowed non-unanimous votes. Since Smith's 2005 jury recommendation had been 10-2, his death sentence was overturned in 2018 under the new standard. However, in April 2020, the Florida Supreme Court reinstated the sentence, holding that the earlier decision remained valid despite the intervening shift in law. Through these appellate stages, Smith's underlying convictions for murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery were never disturbed. Only the sentencing framework shifted, reflecting broader changes in death penalty jurisprudence. In the aftermath of Carlie Brucia's murder, lawmakers sought to address public concern about supervision of offenders. A federal bill known as Carlie's Law was introduced in the 108th Congress in April 2004 by Representative Katherine Harris of Florida, with support from Representatives Nick Lampson of Texas and Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee. The proposal aimed to amend Title 18 of the United States Code and related laws to strengthen parole rules for sex offenders. It also called for notifying non-custodial parents when criminal activity occurred near a child's home, reflecting broader calls for protective reforms. Carlie's father, Joseph Brucia, approved naming the legislation after his daughter, though he noted that the measure would not have applied directly to her case. At the time of her abduction and murder, Joseph Smith was on probation for drug offenses, not sexual crimes, so the bill's provisions would not have prevented the tragedy. Even so, the effort symbolized an attempt to honor Carlie's memory by advocating for systemic change. The bill was considered in relevant House committees, including Judiciary and Transportation and Infrastructure. Despite widespread attention, it failed to pass before the end of the 2004 session. Representative Harris expressed her intention to reintroduce the measure in 2005, but no further congressional action was recorded. Although Carlie's Law did not become federal law, the initiative underscored how a single case can influence policy debate, highlighting concerns about offender monitoring and parental awareness. Joseph P. Smith, convicted of abducting and killing 11-year-old Carlie Brucia, died in prison on July 26, 2021, at the age of 55 while awaiting execution. His reported cause of death was liver cancer. With his passing, ongoing legal proceedings ended, bringing closure to years of litigation that had included appeals, resentencing disputes, and reinstatement of the death penalty. For Carlie's family and community, Smith's death could not erase the pain of her loss, but it marked the end of a long judicial process. Beyond the courtroom, Carlie's case left a significant public imprint.